Hello, welcome back to Epic. Today we're going to talk about natural disasters and climate change. Here I have a collection of natural disasters. Let's see which ones are made worse by climate change and which ones are not. A lot of people think that climate change is everything, and it is not everything, first of all. So let's look at a few examples. First of all, earthquakes. As far as I know, there is no evidence that climate change influences earthquakes at the moment. There are, of course, things that can make worse, I suppose, but there is no clear connection, however, between rising temperatures and CO2 emissions that are linked to quakes and their power. Wildfires, though, yes, because you have parts of the earth that are drier and hotter, and they become more susceptible to fires. So, of course, there are also people starting fires, sometimes intentionally, sometimes accidentally. But I'm talking about natural fires that can spread in hot and dry conditions. It can also spread by lightning, by the way. Tsunamis, there is no evidence that climate change causes tsunamis. Tsunamis are usually a byproduct of earthquakes underwater, like we saw in the disastrous earthquake in Japan. The only thing where climate change might contribute here to the problem is that if the sea levels rise, then the height of the tsunami rises as well. Volcanic eruptions, again, there is no evidence whatsoever that climate change contributes to that. But tornadoes, storms, floods, droughts, all of that, yes, because basically climate change might make things worse because we have more drastic cold fronts and hot fronts, and when they mix together, they create more intense tornadoes and hurricanes and typhoons. So yes, the changing currents of winds could be dangerous and could have adverse effects. And droughts, of course, yes, certain areas will be drier while others will have more moisture. There's a good story with that, actually. The city of Babylon was a very prosperous town back in the days, and essentially people now say that it was partially destroyed by climate change. Of course, yes, people also overcultivated and overgrazed the land at the time, but climate was changing in that region and it became very dry, which resulted in famines, etc. Finally, you got things like coral bleaching. This is very much happening because of climate change. The ocean reacts very strongly to the amount of CO2 pumped into it and the heat pumped into it. And if you look at this map here, this is from the Climate Council in Australia. The red dots are areas where the mortality rate of corals is over 50%. And these are places like the Great Barrier Reef, but also near Guam and Japan, as well as the Christmas Islands. There's over 50% of bleaching in places like Hawaii, Fiji, the Maldives, and the Seychelles. And finally, there is bleaching in consecutive years, which they have been measuring since 2014, at the Great Barrier Reef, Samoa, and Hawaii. So, in conclusion, first of all, I presented the Earth as this very large living organism where the inner parts compose most of the Earth, and we live on a tiny, tiny percentage of it on the crust. Then beyond that, you have the atmosphere, which again, we're talking about livable atmosphere, so roughly 0 to 15 kilometers. And a lot of greenhouse gases that we pump out end up in that layer, which we call the troposphere. We can get information on temperatures and conditions in the world from things called proxies. These are things like pollen and corals, as well as ice cores and tree rings, which give us data for hundreds and thousands of years into the past. Finally, I looked at some natural disasters right now and which ones are exacerbated by climate change and which ones aren't. So now we're going to talk more about the carbon cycle and greenhouse effect. I'm going to talk about climate change concepts like adaptation, mitigation, vulnerability. We'll talk about the RCP index and what it means for future projections. We're going to talk about sea level rise, etc. So there are, of course, you should know natural cycles, but the data currently indicates that they have very negligible effects. So they are not the problem here. The problem is that we need to stop spewing out so much pollution into the atmosphere as well as the oceans.